Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Dan Barry. Welcome to the December MAPP webinar. The topic of today's webinar is modeling at fine scales. We're going to talk about high-resolution modeling efforts, subtitles, research to improve regional and local climate information. So a very exciting webinar today. We have three speakers. In order, we're going to hear from Julia Manginello from COLA first. She's going to talk about some high-resolution work, the Athena project that they did at COLA, and how they're applying that to tropical cyclones in the North Pacific. Then we'll hear from Vasu Misra from Florida State. He's going to talk a little bit about some high-resolution work he's been doing in the Intra-American Seas. And then finally, John Dunn from GFDL, and he'll talk a little bit about high-resolution work up at GFDL and applications of that to ecosystem, marine ecosystem work in the North Atlantic. So thanks, everybody, for joining, and thanks to the speakers in advance. I'm looking forward to hearing these talks. So we'll start out with Julia. Julia, are you on the line?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to transfer control over to your computer, and then just share your screen. So while Julia is sharing her screen, I'd like to remind everybody on the line to please mute their phones. Normally, I have some capability to mute for you if you forget, but unfortunately, I don't have that capability today. So I'm really counting on everyone to check their mute button and make sure that we can't hear them so that we can hear the speakers instead. So Julia, whenever you're ready, it looks good. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good afternoon. This talk is about changes in the typhoon activity at the end of the 21st century, projected by multi-decadal high-resolution simulations conducted as part of Project Athena. Project Athena emerged as a result of a World Modeling Summit in 2008, where a call was made to advance seamless weather and climate modeling. It became possible due to availability of a dedicated computing resource, namely the Athena supercomputer. One of the working hypotheses of this project was that high spatial resolution can improve the fidelity of the models in simulating climate variability and change. This slide shows a subset of Athena experiments used in our study. The atmospheric GCM is the European, oh sorry, this is the wrong slide, here. The atmospheric GCM is the European Center Integrated Forecast System, which is an operational weather forecast model. IFS was integrated in AMIP and time-slice modes at 2 horizontal resolutions, 125 kilometers and 16 kilometers for 47-year periods. The focus of this talk is on the 16-kilometer simulations. To represent the current climate, IFF was forced with the observed records of SST and sea ice. The future climate simulations were carried out following the time-slice approach, where the future SST and sea ice forcing was formed by adding the difference in the annual cycle between the two 10-year time periods in the 21st and the 20th centuries, taken from the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report integration of the CCSM3 to the observed records. In addition, the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations were altered to follow the IPCC A1B emission scenario until the year 2100 and held constant thereafter. I would like to add here that the combination of high resolution and the length of integration makes this data set quite unique. First, high resolution is favorable for studying tropical cyclones, and also long simulation record allows to assess the significance of the climate change signal relative to the internal variability and increase statistical robustness when comparing extremes. So here's a summary of the main results of our study. IFS projects a small and insignificant increase in the seasonal mean typhoon frequency in the future climate. However, the model also shows a significant increase in the frequency of the hurricane strength, tropical cyclones, particularly for the most intense storms, and a significant reduction in the frequency of the weakest systems. This result agrees with the vast majority of the modeling studies on the subject. Mean peak intensity of typhoons shows a large increase in a warmer climate. The latter almost exclusively contributes to about 50% increase in the power dissipation index, as the license distribution remains virtually unchanged. These huge increases in the PDI and the mean peak intensity substantially exceed their standard deviations. In the rest of the talk, I will focus in more detail on the changes in the typhoon frequency, intensity, and structure, time permitting. Here we can see that in the future climate, a clear southward shift of the main genesis regions is projected to take place which is consistent with a small change in the basin-wide typhoon frequency. Genesis and track density changes over the South China Sea are small and insignificant. Consequently, track density increases in the southwest corridor from as far as the dateline to the Southeast Asia and decreases in the center of the basin. It also increases along the northwestern corridor from Japan to higher latitudes. The following few slides address the question of what aspects of the mean climate change are responsible for the shift in the genesis locations. We start with the SST forcing pattern, which is similar to other models with a few exceptions. The largest equatorial SST change occurs west of the dateline, with relatively high SST values over the extreme west. In this sense, SST forcing in our study bears less resemblance with an El Nino-like forcing. In response to this largest ocean warming, IFS stimulates an increase in rainfall mainly confined to the central equatorial Pacific, which is further reinforced by a shift of convection to the region. This shift acts to enhance the pre-existing ascending motions already found there in the current climate. As we show next, this has a dominant influence, both direct and indirect, on the southward shift in tropical cyclone genesis. Our analysis and other studies have shown that the changes in these three fields in the middle panel can be considered as predictors of the genesis density change. So a low level of vorticity, which is indicative of the southeastward extension of the Matsoon Trough, is almost exclusively responsible for the enhanced genesis west of about 165 east. To the east, there is an also equal contribution from increased midtropospheric moistening and vertical ascent associated with increased precipitation in the central equatorial Pacific. In turn, the depressed genesis to the north is driven by anomalous descent, anomalous anticyclonic vorticity linked to the southward extension of the western Pacific subtropical high, and reduced relative humidity in the east. Changes in these fields are in fact comparable in magnitude to their answer response, but occur more in the north-south rather than east-west direction. Tropical cyclone genesis changes are also highly correlated to the pattern of change in the activity of synoptic scale tropical disturbances. As you can see, vertical wind shear changes are small. Here we turn to the question of the typhoon intensity change. This slide shows tropical cyclone or typhoon intensity distributions in the current climate, top panel, and the projected future changes, bottom panel. First, the 16-kilometer IFS demonstrates a fairly good correspondence between the frequency of occurrence of the simulated and observed typhoons at the high end of the intensity scale. The lower panels show quite clearly an upward shift in the intensity distributions in the future climate. This slide compares the future change in the intensity distribution with the changes that occur due to the interannual variability in the model. By comparing upper panels, particularly the red lines, it can be concluded that future changes in the typhoon intensities are comparable with a range of intensity variations due to the model's natural variability. Roughly 10% increase in the fraction of the hurricane strength storms in the future climate is also consistent with other studies. To better understand the typhoon intensity response, we turn to the compositing technique to create a sample of the most intense typhoons in both simulations in order to identify changes in their statistical properties and or physical processes that govern their evolution. In this study, we were able to identify about 50 super typhoons in each simulation and about 100 typhoons of Category 3 equivalent and higher. To compare temporal evolution of the composite storms, we construct intensity life cycles shown on the left. It can be seen at first that the simulated storms do not grow as fast as the observed ones. The growth also starts early in the life cycle, and the gestation period when the storms grow only weekly is longer. The latitude deficiency could actually be partly a consequence of the tracking procedure. Nevertheless, the figure on the left clearly shows that both the intensification rate and the peak intensities of super typhoons increase in the future climate by as much as 5 meters per second or 8% in terms of surface wind speed, and about 4 hectopascal decrease in minimum sea level pressure, corresponding to about 55% increase in pressure deficit. For about 100 typhoon composites, the SLP change is about 10 hectopascal, equivalent to about 11% increase in pressure deficit. An upward shift in the frequency of the most intense tropical cyclones under climate change can be brought about by several factors, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. First, an increase in the duration of storms, as longer-lived storms have more time to intensify, a higher intensification rate, an increase, for example, in potential intensity or decrease in the vertical wind shear along the tracks, which can directly lead to higher lifetime peak intensities. In addition to other factors, which I show on the left, PI and vertical wind shear can also alter the storm development rate. So the left figure here shows changes in the frequency distributions of the storm ambient conditions based on 6-hourly data for super typhoon composites sampled during their intensification phase. Potential intensity of vertical wind shear here are maximum values within 3 degrees radius from the storm center. Other fields are regional averages within 5 degrees of the storm center after spatial filtering to remove the storm influence. So, despite the geographical shift in their formation location, shown by black squares in the right figure, future super typhoons attain their maximum intensity in about the same region east of the Philippines. So first, their lifetime practically doesn't change, as was shown earlier. Left figure indicates that faster development of future super typhoons could be linked to their tendency to develop more to the south and within an environment that is thermodynamically more favorable, shown by higher PI, relative humidity, and lower tropospheric conditional instability values. Their dynamical environment seems to be practically unchanged based on vertical wind shear and low-level relative vorticity distribution. Increase in peak intensity of this storm is likely a result of their tendency to encounter higher PI values. This is an interesting result since there are practically no changes in the seasonal mean PI along the tracks, which I haven't shown here. So the next 2 slides show changes in the vertical structure of the super typhoon composites, and we start with the dynamical structure here. Contours, black contours show distribution in the current climate. Fading signifies future changes that are statistically significant. Comparison is made at the time when the storm reached maximum intensity. So the upper left figure shows that the system scale amplification of the primary circulation throughout the troposphere, with the largest increase at the level of maximum winds inside the eye wall, resulting in slight reduction of the radius of maximum winds and the overall size of the composite tropical cycle. Tangential wind distribution becomes taller and narrower, although these changes are rather subtle. The boundary layer inflow is amplified as seen in the middle left figure, particularly inside the radius of maximum wind, consistent with a stronger spin-up. There is an anomalous outflow above the shallow inflow. Weak anomalous inflow in the mid-troposphere is considered to be important for inner core warming. Upper tropospheric outflow is enhanced and appears to extend to higher altitudes. By continuity, there is a larger upward mass flux in the eye wall, which is lower left figure, on top of the boundary layer, consistent with inflow changes, and in the middle troposphere as a result of stronger diabatic heating. Although you can see here that IFS doesn't resolve the eye very well, at least in the composite sense. The right figure shows full distributions of vertical velocity, including the extremes such as maximum updrafts and downdrafts in the AMIP top and time-slice bottom experiments. In the future climate, the frequency of intense updrafts is projected to increase throughout the troposphere. The extremely strong updrafts become more intense, mainly at the surface, at the top of the boundary layer, and the mid-troposphere. The largest updraft speed shown here by this extreme percentage of occurrence shift to higher altitude to about 600 to 400 hectopascal compared to 700 hectopascal in the present climate. And this slide, which is the last one, shows changes in the thermodynamic structure where in a warmer climate, the largest increase of equivalent potential temperature occurs in the boundary or inflow layer, particularly at the surface, and the inner core due to increase in temperature and specific humidity, especially at the surface, while relative humidity is almost unchanged. So comparable gain in the inner core theta E results from the upward transport of the warm and moisture boundary layer by means of intense eye wall convection, as well as stronger upper tropospheric heat release, latent heat release, which becomes more pronounced 6 and 12 hours post-intensification, which I don't show here. The largest increase in the inner core theta E occurs at the same altitude level as the largest increase in the speed of extremely strong updrafts that I showed in the previous slide. So this further supports the finding that in the future climate eye wall convection will be significantly enhanced, leading to stronger diabatic heating aloft, stronger warm core, and subsequent adjustment of the secondary circulation and vortex spin-up. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Julia. Are there any questions for Julia?
Julia, hi, this is Anarita. I got a question.
Hi.
So do you have a sense of the sensitivity of these results to resolution?
Yes, I showed in a couple of slides also results from a 125-kilometer version of the model, and it's drastically different. That model, while it also shows practically no change in the typhoon frequency, it doesn't show any upward shift in the intensity distribution at all.
This is Tom Knudsen. Very interesting talk. So we, as I understand, you're finding fewer, in your high-resolution experiment, fewer of tropical storms, but more of the most intense typhoons. Is that
correct? Correct, yes.
Yeah, we find the same thing in a study just published for the Atlantic Basin, where we find a reduction in tropical storms and hurricane frequency, but an increase in the Category 4 and 5 storms in the future climate projections. And I think a number of other studies show a similar, qualitatively similar result, where you tend to get fewer of the sort of average intensity storms, but more of the most intense. So it's like a change in the intensity distribution.
Right.
So this does seem to be sort of consistent with those previous studies for other basins. It's kind of interesting.
Right. We actually tried to go a little further here and try to understand the underlying causes of this change, including trying to peek into the changes in structure, which is a little hard to do certainly at this resolution. But I think they're quite consistent with the the overall statistical changes like frequency and categories and so forth.
Did you look at precipitation changes in the?
Unfortunately, we couldn't do it because in these runs, the field was accumulated over 6 hours, and we couldn't really get the right temporal resolution.
Any other questions for Julia? We have time for maybe one more if there's another one out there. Okay, well, Julia, thanks a lot, and thanks for the questions, Anarita and Tom.
Thank you.
Okay, Vasu, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Great. I'm going to change control over to your computer, and you can share your desktop.
Okay. You can see my desktop?
Not yet. You got to click that button. Click the Share My Desktop button.
Sorry. Have you given me the control yet?
Yeah. If you don't see it, are you in Event Center? If you look at the top left of your screen, it'll say Event Center.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, looks good. Yeah, just go full screen with your slides, and then whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. I'm going to talk about some high-resolution integrations that we have done with a regionally coupled ocean atmosphere model centered over the Intra-American Seas. This is a work that I've done with my colleague here at Florida Climate Institute and COAPS at Florida State University, Dr. Hai-Chin Lee. So I'm just showing you this, an observational plot of the seasonal mean climatology in June, July, August, in the middle panel of rainfall, the annual mean rainfall over the continental U.S., and the winter seasonal mean rainfall. And the point that I'm trying to emphasize is that along the southeastern U.S. coast, the Gulf Coast especially, both in the summertime and in the wintertime, you have a relatively large maximum. In fact, if you look by the volume of water over the whole season, you would see that the eastern half receives far more than the western half if you were to ignore the Pacific Northwest. And correspondingly, the seasonal variance is also pretty large. And the reason why I'm showing this very well-known figure is to emphasize that most of this water that we see in terms of precipitation has more than likely its origins in the Gulf of Mexico and the Intra-American Seas. And so the entire thesis of my talk is that in order to get the U.S. hydroclimate right, at least for the eastern half, we need to get the simulation of the Intra-American Seas reasonably well. And if you look at the seasonal time scale, the kind of forecast that CPC issues, we are confronted usually with a forecast with equal chances over the eastern half during the summertime. And that could be due to the inherent predictability issues, or it could be inherent with the model issues in the summertime. But nonetheless, it certainly is a huge challenge, at least in the eastern part of the U.S., to come with a forecast that the users could use usefully on the seasonal time scale. Now, if I go back to a paper that appeared in Journal of Climate in 2005 by King-Se-Mo, she did a moisture budget study over the continental U.S. using the North American Regional Reanalysis. And what she found was that a large moisture flux vectors actually originate from the Gulf of Mexico, both over the winter time as well as in the summertime from the Gulf of Mexico, again emphasizing the important role of the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, there are some authors who claim that the Corn Belt will not be called Corn Belt but for Gulf of Mexico because of the tremendous amount of moisture that it supplies to the eastern half of the continental U.S. And yet, and again, if you look at some of our own work at looking at drought years in the southeastern U.S., and wet years in some of the episodical seasons in the summertime, you see that the difference between dry and wet years, at least over the southeastern U.S., is exhibited by the extra moisture source over the Caribbean and the tropical Western Atlantic region. So characterizing the interannual variability of the hydroclimate in the southeastern U.S. is characterized by whether you get excess moisture from the Caribbean Sea region or not. So given all this importance of the fact that so much moisture is getting pumped in to this part of the continental U.S., we see, ironically, that the IS region is rather poorly observed, and it is in fact as poorly observed as the polar oceans. And this is just a snapshot from the GTS showing you the XPT coverage of the XPTs across the globe for a sample, and this is about 3 or 4 years old. But nonetheless, I think it is reflective of the present situation that over the Intra-American Seas region, the amount of observations is comparable to what you have in the polar oceans. And in fact, this is a slide that I have borrowed from David Enfield from AOML, which shows that the amount of ocean observations from the 70s, at least in this part of the oceans, has reduced in the recent decades. So it's an irony of sorts that we reconcile with the idea that there is tremendous, the Gulf of Mexico and the Intra-American Seas region is a very important supplier of moisture to the eastern half of the U.S., and yet it is one of the most poorly observed global oceans, most poorly observed part of the global oceans. And if we go and look at the IPCC simulations, both at from the AR4 simulations or the CMIP3 simulations, there's a pathological cold bias. The top panel over here is the observations from the NOAA OI SST, and these are the various CMIP3 models. And you can see there is a pervasive cold bias across these models. And if we then look at the CMIP5 models, what I'm showing you in a tabular format over here is the area of the 28.5 degree isotherm average over July, August, and September season. And the top row over here is the ERSST, and the area is in million square kilometers. And I don't know if you're able to read these numbers, but this is in the order of 2.4, 3.7, 3.9, or 4 million square kilometers. And there is barely any model which reaches this figure. And in fact, the model that reaches this figure over here has got some other very grave errors in the Eastern Atlantic and in the Western Pacific, like the CSI Aero model. And even in the GIST model, there are some very grave errors in the Eastern Atlantic. But the other models don't even come close enough to the observed area of the 28.5 degree isotherm. So there is the pervasive cold bias from the CMIP3 has continued along even in the CMIP5 models over the IAS region. So from here on, I'm going to now talk about our regional coupled simulations to see if we find any clues in ameliorating this cold bias problem over the Intra-American Seas region. So what we are using as our regional model is the RSM coupled to ROMS. It is at 15-kilometer grid resolution. The coupling interval between the atmospheric component and the oceanic component is 1 day. There is no flux correction. Both the ocean and the atmosphere are laterally forced by R2 for the atmosphere and SEP-R2 reanalysis, and SODA with the ocean. And this is the model physics of the RSM. Further details can be obtained from our papers that are available online in Climate Dynamics or on my website. This is the regional domain that we have downscaled from the NSEP-R2 and SODA. And these boxes are shown because we'll be showing you the time series of this 30-year simulation from 1982 to the present over these area average over these boxes later on. The first important thing that we find, and what we're going to do is, we are going to compare this simulation that is downscaled from NSEP-R2 and SODA with CFS-R reanalysis, which is one of the most contemporary reanalysis, which is also, quote unquote, called the coupled global reanalysis. So the first thing that we show over here is the standard deviation of the annual mean sea surface height, and you can see that this is from satellite observations altimeter data. And this is, by the way, our analysis, our downscale integration is called the Regional Ocean Atmosphere Coupled Downscaling of Global Reanalysis over the Intra-American Seas, or ROARS. So the ROARS shows the sea surface height variance, certainly far more than what the observations indicate over the Yucatan Channel, but certainly something comparable at least over the Gulf of Mexico and far more over the Western Atlantic out here. On the other hand, the CFS reanalysis completely misses this variance in the sea surface height. Now, if I what I've shown in the next slide is a snapshot of the monthly mean surface ocean currents, and you can see very clearly that as in the observations, we have purposefully chosen this period because it shows a loop current and the eddies coming off of it and trailing all the way to the western Gulf. And likewise, you see that in roars, you do find at the same instance, there is a loop current and there are eddies, obviously not located at the same location as the observations indicate. But the CFS reanalysis is very weakly suggesting a loop current, but certainly no eddies. And if you continue along 6 months later, the same story continues, but again, CFSR misses a large fraction of this variance completely because it's just not able to resolve the surface ocean currents. Now, there are many studies which have revealed the importance of this loop current through the Yucatan Channel as a very important heat transport mechanism from the warmer Caribbean Sea into the Gulf of Mexico. And obviously, most of these global models are so coarse in resolution that they are unable to resolve this feature. And therefore, we argue that it is impossible for the CMIP-5 class of models or such global models to resolve this mesoscale feature in the ocean, and therefore a large fraction of the cold bias, at least in this part of the Intra-American Seas region, cannot be resolved at these resolutions. We also looked at the midsummer drought over Central America from this road simulation and compared it with CFSR, and again we see this peak in June and August and a minimum in July, which is reasonably well simulated both in CFSR as well as in RORS, but the RORS shows it far more amplified than CFSR. And this, we again see that there is a bimodal distribution like this even in the SST, in the neighboring SST region. And therefore, we again believe that this is a cloud radiative feedback phenomenon as the previous studies have related it to. If we look at the Caribbean low-level jet, this is the 925 hectopascal wind climatology over a 30-year period and corresponding 30-year climatology from the CFSR. And this black dot is the region where we have pulled out this profile, the seasonal cycle of 925 hectopascal winds, and the black line is the observed radiosonde data over the similar 30-year period. And again, the Caribbean low-level jet seems to be well simulated in both these models. One has to remember here that the CFSR is assimilating the radiosonde data set. RORS is not. RORS is just is a long-term simulation forced with the lateral boundaries from R2 and from SODA. So it has no CFSR information going into RORS.
Hi, Vasu. Sorry to interrupt, but please try to finish up in a couple minutes so we have time for any questions. Thanks.
Sure, thanks. These are my last few slides, and I'm showing you the area average sea surface temperatures over the 4 different domains. And again, the sea surface temperatures have a correlation hovering around 0.8 or 0.7 or 0.8 in all of these subdomains in the regional domain. And again, this is reflecting the bias that has been fixed by resolving the surface ocean currents. And likewise, precipitation has also got slightly higher correlations than what the CFSR displays. In conclusion, I would say that the role of IIS on U.S. hydroclimate is well recognized, and in some ways it is still being ignored in the kind of density of observations and the perennial cold bias problem in all these global models. CFSR is also resolving loop current, but the resolution is not enough. And I'll stop here and take any questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Vasu. So are there any questions on the line or from here in the room? When we went to questions for Julia, I think some folks may have still had their lines muted. So apologies if you tried to ask a question. What I'm going to do now is unmute all of the phone lines. If everyone could check, if you're called in on a hard line phone, please check and make sure that your mute button is on. But I'm going to unmute you from this end, from the WebEx end, to see if we have any questions. That's unintelligible. Does anybody have a question? Okay, Vasu, I had one question. Comparing some of the observations, here that the loop current, real quick. It was pretty clear that the loop current's not resolved. It's not picking up eddies and whatnot. I was wondering if you've measured or taken a metric of through flow between Cuba and Florida to compare to what CFS is producing and how far that's off 20%, 50% more. It looked like quite a bit potentially, but I was wondering if you had isolated that. I don't think so. Well, it looks like Vasu, we may have lost Vasu, actually. Oh, he's back. Okay.
Yes, I'm back.
Hi, Vasu. Yeah, did you hear the question?
No, I did not.
Okay, so I was just asking, it seems in CFS it's pretty clear from what you showed that the loop current, some of the eddy structures are not well resolved. I was wondering if you had taken measure of the difference between CFS and some of the OBS for through flow between Cuba and Florida and how far off that is, if you have any.
No, we have not done that. We are that work is underway, so we might have the answers in the next few weeks.
Okay, because it seemed like it was still picking that up to some extent, but I was wondering how far it's off, if it's 50% or more or whatever.
No, CFSR is bound to pick up some evidence of loop current because it is assimilating some of those buoy data that is still coming through the GTS. So it should have some signature of it, but it is getting it just because of that, and the resolution, the coarse resolution, relatively coarse resolution of CFSR is losing the signature that it should really have.
Okay. All right, thanks. Any other questions here? No, I'm not going to go back to the phone line because there was a ton of noise. So, Vasu, thanks a lot for the talk. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, final speaker is John Dunn. John, you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Great. I'm going to transfer control over to your computer, so please click Share My Desktop.
You got it?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, so I'm going to give a status report of our efforts to prototype global Earth system models at high resolution, narrowing in at the representation of eastern boundary currents and their climate, biogeochemistry, and ecosystems. This work is, the present study by myself, Charlie Stock, and Jasmine John would not be possible without the long-term efforts by our GFDL climate group at high-resolution model development, which is noted in the paper by Delworth et al. So I'll talk a little bit about eastern boundary currents under climate change, motivate the need for a hierarchy of model approaches, and go through some of our initial prototyping results. So eastern boundary currents are some of the world's most productive fisheries. They're characterized by not only high production, but also hypoxia and low pH and natural acidification. This has consequences for shellfish and oysters, crabs, dead zones, as well as, and is a particular acidification and climate concern, notably because we have observed long-term increases in hypoxia in the California current system. So in a paper published in 2010 with an early coarse resolution 1 degree Earth system model at GFDL ESM 2.1, we noted that the change in temperature in the upper left panel under climate warming out to 2100 is focused most highly in the northwestern Pacific, with the California current system warming being relatively mild. Corresponding with that, on the upper right panel, you see that while we project
decreasing nutrient concentrations in the surface waters. We, for the gyre as a whole, we project increasing nutrients in the California current system, such that while the model is representing the observed inverse relationship between temperature and nutrients on seasonal and triennial timescales, on the long timescale, we see a direct relationship of increasing temperatures leading to increasing nitrate. Whoop. So Ryan dug into the mechanisms at work here, which are demonstrated in the schematic, and that in the pre-industrial conditions, nutrient supply to the California current system was originating in nutrient-limited oligotrophic waters, which had a relatively short transit time to the California current. Under climate change, with a polar shift of the winds, we see a migration of the source water region towards more light-limited waters, so more nutrient-rich, and a longer propagation time into the California current system. Both processes leading to an increase in nutrients in that region, with the dominance of remote forcing rather than local forcing. So this demonstrated to us that you really needed a very large-scale modeling approach to address the question of what kind of changes should we expect under climate warming, but are we using the right tool for the job? So if you look at the data set that Dick Feely published in Science back and co-authors in 2008, you see that this intensified nutrient remineralization and associated acidification are a coherent feature all along the California eastern boundary current system, but restricted to about 10 to 100 kilometers from the coast. The modes of variability that are driving these features are the seasonal cycle, remote intraannual forcings like ENSO-PDO, NPGO, weather timescales, mesoscale eddies, squirts, fronts, jets, as well as the diurnal sea breeze. Only about 2 or 3 of these mechanisms is the 1-degree model capable of representing. So with the inability to represent position and variability of major current structures, scales of coastal or coral-driven upwelling topography interactions, and the mechanistic ecology, we're at a loss in terms of characterizing the robustness of the climate change response to this very critical marine ecosystem. So we think that about 1/10 of a degree is necessary to simulate these scales, and which is computationally very expensive. And also, in terms of the Earth system interactions, adding biogeochemical tracers on the order of 30 for the GFDL's Earth system models is computationally very expensive as well. So in order to make progress scientifically, what we've decided to take is a multi-pronged approach, relying on the coarse resolution CMIP-5, coupled model in comparison Project 5 generation Earth system models that are at the 1-degree scale for oceans, and then adding to that an ongoing effort to improve the ecological mechanisms for living marine resource applications through Charlie Stock's Cobalt effort, and thirdly, running in comparison with that, a set of reduced biogeochemical tracer runs that are more computationally viable for perturbation experiments at high resolution. I'm only going to talk about the first 2 of these today. So this brings us to the Earth system model prototype that I'll show some results from. It's a 1/10 degree ocean, 1/2 degree atmosphere. It includes the cobalt biogeochemistry land ecosystem. It runs on 15,000, almost 16,000 cores. It gets about 5 model months per day and takes about 100 gigabytes per month of archive space. So looking first at California current system, you see in the upper panel that the observations show a extensive upwelling all along the western seaboard from the border down to Point Conception in California, whereas in our coarse resolution Earth system model, the flow migrates offshore into a subtropical or temperate gyre circulation that's fictional that I call the Rickoszewski current, and he calls the Dunn current. And then we see in ESM 2.6 that we are able to rectify that problem to a large extent and conserve vorticity without this extra fictitional gyre circulation. In the Humboldt system, we see that in the coarse resolution model, we don't represent the decreasing temperature associated with upwelling at all in the coarse in that model, and we do a much better job at this 10th degree version. You see that in the Humboldt the flow moves offshore, whereas in the coarse resolution model it's directly alongshore, and that issue is rectified at high resolution. Moving to the Canary current, we see a similar improvement in the meridional structure and removal of spurious recirculation, and as well in the Benguela, where the coarse resolution model does not represent the eastern boundary current upwelling expression in terms of temperature at all, and the high resolution model does a much better job. So to get a little bit more quantitative on this, I'm showing the sea surface temperatures in observations in black, the coarse resolution model in red, and the high resolution model in blue, where I've added a contour range just to guide your eye for the coarse resolution model. And we can see that in the high resolution case, we're really doing a much better job at representing the magnitude and spatial extent of the reduction in temperature moving onshore in all of these areas, with a major limitation being that we still represent the warmest waters, a bias in the warmest waters not representing that decrease in temperature towards the shore. Getting a little bit more specific, here's a property plots comparing the satellite AVHRR sea surface temperatures with the models. And you can see that these model biases growing at higher temperatures in the Humboldt and Canary current systems, and fairly constant in the California current system, with Benguela doing something much more interesting. Moving to the chlorophyll response, we see a huge improvement, I would say, in the representation of the high productivity region near shore compared to the sea-with satellites, and same in the Humboldt and in the Canary current, as well as the Benguela current, where in all cases we represent the poleward extent of the upwelling system quite well, but at high resolution, but we have a high bias overall in the pelagic region, open ocean region, and a lack of expression of the equatorward extent of the upwelling. So again, looking at chlorophyll versus distance offshore, you can see that similar to temperature, we're now seeing the enhancement at the coastal scales, though we are not yet achieving the magnitude of chlorophyll increase onshore. talking to ROMS experts working in the California current system at PMEL, they suggested that this might be due to the lack of cyst-forming diatoms to seed the upwelling centers. Another ecological interaction that's not represented in these global models yet. So again, looking at these property plots, you can see that for the California current system, we're doing a much better job at trying to reach that one-to-one line, but that at high chlorophyll values, we are still exhibiting a damped response. And then finally, moving to the acidification consequences, here's I show pH at 100 meters in these 4 eastern boundary currents, just to give you a sense of how different they all are at the large scale, and how much more complex the interactions are going to be, where they all have their different source water characterizations for the upwelling. Moving to the surface water expression of pH, you see a natural acidification right along the coast, but when you go to these plots with distance from shore, you see for the California current system actually increasing pH on the large scale over the few hundred kilometers towards the coast, with a marked decrease only right at the coast, within tens of kilometers from the coast. In the Humboldt current, we see more of the similar kind of scales of coastal acidification as was seen for the chlorophyll, and then in Canary current, a sort of a bimodal structure of some acidification waters represented, and then as well as in Benguela. So progress and challenges. I hope I've made the case that we'll need some novel and synergistic approaches to do the science. In this case, it's otherwise computationally prohibitive. We're trying an approach of doing many touchstone experiments of different resolution and complexity to explore the full range of uncertainties. And critical to this effort is the exercise of multiple applications, such as eastern boundary currents, to take advantage of the same model run for science. Initial prototyping demonstrates the strength at representing the mesoscale, with SST gradients generally well represented, chlorophyll gradients existing but damped, and pH gradients existing but having complex structure awaiting further analysis. Challenges that remain include that many large-scale biases still exist at high resolution and await further development. Coastal acidification is a work in progress, with benthic, pelagic, estuarine, and other interactions still missing, and reduced biogeochemical algorithm alternatives requiring careful inspection. And that's all I have for you today.
Great. Thank you very much, John. I won't dare to unmute all the phone lines again, given how much noise there was last time. But if anybody on the phone has a question for John, please use the chat feature from the top of your screen. If you go to the top of your screen, there's a chat button. You can send me a message. Let me know if you have a question, and I can unmute your phone line. But in the meantime, while we wait to see if anybody does use that feature, are there any questions from any of the other speakers or from anybody in the room here for John? John, I had one question. I'm wondering if you could kind of summarize some of your thoughts about why there's such a strong open ocean bias in surface chlorophyll in all of the current cases that you showed.
So the model that we ran, one of the challenges with this ultra high resolution effort is that the model that we ran, we could only run for 29 years. So that is the first look at a completely untuned, unanalyzed simulation. So why the chlorophyll was high depends on the balance of the representation of phytoplankton physiology and getting the correct nutrient supply. Without having the nutrient field in quasi-geophysical equilibrium and being self-consistent, it's hard to know whether the model even should be realistic in terms of chlorophyll. So typically we run these models out for hundreds and hundreds of years so that they get a consistent biogeochemical interactions between all the tracers. But just running it out very, very briefly doesn't give us the opportunity to do that kind of assessment.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the explanation. That makes sense. So I haven't seen any questions come in through the chat feature, so I'm going to assume that there aren't any. So I'd like to thank all of the speakers. A really interesting series of talks today, all the way from some of the physics aspects to some applications in the ecosystem. So it was very stimulating. Thank you for taking the time to speak. I appreciate it. We have a webinar scheduled for January 14th. It's on the topic of model development. We're still finalizing some of the speakers, but we're going to hear from the leaders of some new climate process teams that are being funded by the MAPP program on the topic of clouds, and also there's a project at GFDL on sea ice and ice sheet calving. And we'll hear from GFDL on some of their model development plans, as well as NCEP on some of their model development plans. So we're going to pack a lot into this webinar, but it should be really interesting and very contextual for some of the things going on at NOAA and some of the directions that the centers are taking. So thanks again to the speakers. Thanks everybody for joining, and I hope that you'll join again next month. Take care. Happy New Year.